And the Torah portion for this week is Vayigash, which means and drew near. And we'll look at a little more depth at another context for Yigash, the verb that's being used there, which means to draw near, to approach. It actually suggests a very close approach, and it has a connection to something some of you may be familiar with, which is that great sea monster, Leviathan. It's actually a description of Leviathan's scales. And so we should be able to get a better idea of what's going on between Joseph and Judah in the Torah portion by referencing how close the scales are on Leviathan. And so I don't really have anything clever for a title this week. At this point, it's just the testimony and the Torah. Something brilliant might hit me before the end of the week, but I wouldn't put money on it at this point. So the readings for those who are listening by audio are Genesis 44:18 through 47:27. The Haftorah, which we will read in its entirety, if you want to have your Bible handy for that, is Ezekiel 37:15 through 28. And that's the famous two-stick, one-stick prophecy. But we'll also want to reference the dry bones prophecy that precedes it, because it's important in tying those two sections of Ezekiel 37 together. And then our psalm is 48. And I didn't list a particular Brit Chadashah portion because it seems like this week I selected more single verses to illustrate points than a particular passage. So we'll be looking at some passages in Galatians, but primarily in Revelation. Because what we'll be doing, the direction we're headed, is to look at this approach of Judah to Joseph and to use that to decode why so many times in the book of Revelation it refers to the testimony and the commandments, or the testimony and the word. And there is context for that, believe it or not, within Rabbinic Judaism. It's not a brand new idea in the book of Revelation. And so if there was an understanding in the Jewish mindset of the testimony and the commandments preceding and during John's lifetime, then it would be good for us to know what that context is, and maybe it'll open up more in the interaction here between Judah and Joseph. And so here's your memory book. I know I think we skipped a week because I was on the road last week. So let's go forward to, I don't think we did Miketz together. So to Vayeshev, I added Miketz, and Miketz means at the end. So I just, my sentence is Miketz. At the end of Joseph's captivity, he interpreted Pharaoh's dream and was promoted to second in Egypt, which brings us to this week's. And I did settle for just one sentence for Vayigash. And I have, when Judah Vayigash drew near Joseph to offer himself in the place of Benjamin, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers and settled them in Goshen. There's interesting history about Goshen, by the way. It is thought that when Pharaoh dismissed Abraham and Sarah from Egypt because her presence in Pharaoh's household brought a plague on Egypt, and Pharaoh, finally got a clue that Sarah wasn't Abraham's sister, it was his wife. And as long as Abraham's wife was in his household, then plagues would continue to break out. And so he sent Abraham and Sarah away with a lot of loot. And the tradition tells us that when he sent them away, he actually gave them title to a property in Goshen. And that's why later, when Joseph's family comes to Egypt, that there's a recommendation there that they settle in Goshen, and then the Pharaoh does settle them in Goshen. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but it's just a little interesting midrashic comment on why that particular place. So let's just look at the very first verse of Genesis 44:18, and probably, even though we know there's a whole Torah portion associated with it, it's this dynamic between Judah and Joseph that I'd like to look at tonight, because to this day, this is a troubled relationship between Judah and Joseph, between Judah and those who have been exiled among the nations. There is still some tension in that relationship, and I think a lot of misunderstanding in that relationship. And I think misunderstanding primarily comes because we don't know the role of ourselves and the other, or we can't appreciate the other's role. And once we know what the role is, both ours and theirs, then I think we can be much more comfortable. We can be much more tolerant of the differences. And we can appreciate that in the end, it's going to take both. And that's why you have this paradigm in Vayigash of Judah and Joseph growing close, or where Judah approaches Joseph in a very close space. So it says, then Judah approached him, and that's Vayigash, and said, "O my Lord, may your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ears, and do not be angry with your servant, for you are equal to Pharaoh." Now we might want to unpack a few of those words, because we might see those words, or at least those concepts, in other places. And what we can see here is, as Judah approaches Joseph, he's acknowledging that Joseph appears to either already be angry, or he appears to be headed in that direction of anger. Otherwise, he doesn't need to say, "Don't be angry." He doesn't need to anticipate that if Joseph's not already giving off signals. And then he tells him why he shouldn't be angry. He'll say, "Because you are equal to Pharaoh." And as we go back again into some of the ancient commentary about Joseph and Judah in this situation, they say that Joseph and Judah, this situation is much bigger than Joseph and Judah at that time period. They actually represent two competing missions of Israel. And that's the question. If a single nation has two missions, and somehow those two missions appear to be competing with one another, you have the recipe for conflict and anger. And so they say that this Torah portion gives the prophecy, the paradigm for how those two competing missions in the end will eventually come near or approach the other. And again, I say when this approach occurs, it's in a much closer manner than we get from just the plain English text. Approach, it might mean like you just walk up to somebody and shake their hand. It's much closer than that. It almost makes me wonder, we're not given this in the text, but based on the implication of the verb Vayigash, which is going to be Yegash in its verb form, it almost makes me wonder if Judah actually approached close enough to either embrace Joseph or to even speak in his ear. It's that, close to one another. It's where two bodies would literally be right up next to each other. And so the rabbis say that this incident between Joseph and Judah represents two respective houses. We know there is a house of Judah, Well, that's my newest brand new phrase. The house of Judah and Joseph are represented here because we know Joseph is at times, the house of Joseph is called Israel, referring to the 10 northern tribes. Sometimes he's called Ephraim. Judah has his own identity, but within Judah, you also have the tribes of Benjamin and Shimon. And so the tribes in terms of territory, it's not so clear cut, even though they have boundaries and so forth and specific portions, it changes in the Messianic kingdom. Instead of being really strange boundaries that don't, I mean, they might make geographical sense if you had feet on the ground, but if you're looking at a map, it looks like it's all over the place. But in the Messianic kingdom, when you look at how that map is drawn, it's very straight. It's pretty much just straight levels. And the rabbis say that those lines, those straight lines, and I didn't think to put a map on here to show you, but I think if you go into some of your old videos, you can find it, that those straight lines run east to west around the world. And I had not read that before. I never thought of them as being anything other than the boundaries designated, but they say that those boundary designations really don't limit it because of the prophecy that's given to the house of Jacob and how he will enlarge his tent in such a way that it would encompass the world. And so ultimately those 12 tribes will in some way extend their boundaries, their authority, their ability to lead and so forth, and east-west lines of those portions if you look at the final boundaries. But they believe this is just pure prophecy. And so as we look at Vayigash as the pure prophecy, the face-to-face, the mouth-to-mouth prophecy given to Moses, then it helps to know that before we read the dry bones and the two-stick prophecies in Ezekiel, because Ezekiel's not the first revelation of this prophecy. It's actually coming out of the Torah portion, Vayigash. So let's look at the verse in Hebrew, if you can read it. If you can't, don't worry about it too much, because I tried to condense the points that I want to make in Hebrew into English, especially that Judah is using the word devar, which is word. He wants to speak a word to Joseph. And one thing we're going to do for anybody who's new, who's never done the study in what is the Torah and doesn't have that glossary list of equivalent expressions to Torah, we're going to do that tonight. We'll do it briefly. We won't do the whole booklet, but we will do a few slides to make sure everybody's up to speed and to make sure that everyone understands that when you see word in scripture, it's devar in Hebrew, then it is equivalent expression to Torah, the books of Moses. So the reason for putting it up there in Hebrew is so that you could see that Judah is repeatedly calling himself an Eved. Eved, that's a servant in Hebrew. And that's something I want you to remember about this interaction is Judah refers to himself as a servant. Secondly, he wants to speak a devar. He wants to speak a word to Joseph. Since that's an equivalency of expression, and we'll get to that in case you don't leave it, we'll get to that. But the word, just to kick us off here, is going to be equivalent at some point to Torah. So if you can see it as prophecy, then you'll understand that Judah is about to speak a Torah to Joseph. Third point, he tells Joseph that he, Joseph, is like Pharaoh. Now, the English NASB, I think, says you're equal to, and that's a fine translation. That will work. But I wanted you to see in Hebrew, he says, ki chamocha. And you may even know that phrase already. If you do any of the Hebrew liturgy in your fellowship or congregation, you probably sing a song called Mi chamocha, Be'elim Adonai, who is like thee, O Lord, among the gods. And so here, Judah is telling Joseph, Ki chamocha ke paro, you are like Pharaoh. And so there again, he's making an equivalency of expressions. And in fact, he's telling Joseph not to be angry because of this, because you are like Pharaoh. I don't want you to be angry. In other words, there is something about being like Pharaoh that would make you prone to anger or violence. And so later, as we work through the history of Israel, then we realize that, eventually there will be a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph, who doesn't remember Joseph, and he's going to enslave the Hebrew people. A time will come when the Hebrews are brought out of Egypt, and Pharaoh, just like the king of Babylon and his generation, he's going to come to represent the world system. And so he is going to take captive, just like we saw with Joseph, he was sold into captivity in Egypt. And eventually, Joseph's house, Israel, his whole house will be brought into captivity in Egypt. And so even though, yes, Judah is brought into captivity, it's not just the house of Joseph that's taken into captivity in Egypt. Yes, Judah and Benjamin too. However, it's a particularity that the story begins with Joseph himself and alone being sold into captivity. He's that representative tribe. So Egypt represents Joseph's captivity, whereas Babylon will later represent Judah's captivity. That's just a good rule of thumb. When you're reading prophecy, like if you are over in the prophets and the writings and you're reading through it, understanding that they're not completely different, but they are representative. And so as Egypt is to Joseph, so Babylon will later be to Judah. So here's what we have from the Jewish tradition. And then I want to take you into the Brit Hadashah as it concerns this relationship. And I took this from Rabbi Kook, a fairly well-known rabbi, chief rabbi of Israel from back around the turn of the century. And he had a unique relationship to the nations. Rabbi Kook is one of those Orthodox rabbis who felt that among the nations, there was a people that would return. And he was looking for those exiles among those people who would return to Israel. Way more so than typical. He had a heart for the exiles that he felt were among the Gentiles. And so maybe he was particularly tuned into this particular paradigm. And it says, he wrote in his book, which he didn't actually write the book. These were his students who just collected his lectures and letters and so forth. But he said that Joseph represents Israel's responsibility to be a light to the nations, and it's a universal responsibility. Judah, on the other hand, represents the nation's own responsibility for spiritual development, being obedient to the Torah. Now, does he draw this from the particular turn of phrase where it says, Judah wants to speak a word, a davar, to Joseph, davar being equivalent to the Torah? Maybe, we don't know. He doesn't give the rationale for this conclusion. And so this is a direct quote from his book. It says the Jewish people are crowned, and when he says Jewish, most Hebrew roots people are going to read Israel, and that's fine. He says the Jewish people are crowned with two qualities: edut, testimony, and Torah. As it says, God established testimony in Jacob. He set down Torah in Israel. And he's quoting there from Psalm 78:5. He asks, what are these two qualities? The essence of edut is to report facts as they occurred. There's an event, something happened, and you were the eyewitness. You have to report this incident as it occurred or as it was passed on to you, word for word, accurately. He says nothing may be added or altered when giving testimony. Torah study, on the other hand, and he's saying this quality of edut is a unique responsibility of Joseph. It's going to be Joseph's job to report facts, to give the testimony of what occurred. Torah study, on the other hand, which we know he identifies with Judah, he says requires creative thought. And he's talking here about the very process that we go through every week when we study a Torah portion. It requires work. You have to think creatively. You have to stretch your brain. You have to have, or it helps to, have a little bit of Torah, Hebrew, in order to read the words of the Torah and to see the puns and the play on words and the turns of phrase and the doubled verbs and those sort of things. So yeah, you really do have to stretch your brain in order to study the Torah. He says this dichotomy is the root of the conflict between Jacob's sons. Joseph stressed edut, as it says, a testimony for Joseph in Psalm 81:6. The aspect of edut reflects Joseph's desire to interact with the nations and expose them to the message of monotheism and morality. In other words, Joseph's testimony is not going to be as exacting as Judah's intense Torah study. He's going to preach a general message of monotheism and a Torah-based morality. He says Judah emphasized the Torah and the special holiness of the Jewish people. I misspelled that. They sought, not south, to develop and cultivate the unique heritage of Israel. And I think we have to agree, if you want to understand the culture, the ancient culture of the Bible, then you definitely do look to Orthodox Judaism to find those things that have been handed down through the ages. There's even a culture of the Bible. Their existence is based on a culture of the Bible if they are observant. And therefore it affects literally every second of their lives, from the time they go to bed to the time they wake up to when they even go in the bathroom. I mean, there's even a blessing for that in the morning. And so, yes, it's a very minute, exacting application of the Torah. Much different than what we see out among the nations, where basically it's a message of monotheism. There's only one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it stresses a Torah-based morality. We might hear it called a Judeo-Christian heritage. And Rabbi Kook says that when we read the Torah portion by Vayigash, we're actually seeing a prophecy of how this would develop through history. And whether we agree with it or think it's right or not, it happened. It happened in exactly this way. Judah is known for the most exacting methods of Torah study, the most exacting applications of Torah study, the the culture of Torah study. In fact, there's certain sources like in the Midrash, when you read the stories, it's like everything in the Midrash is eventually going to lead back to establishing a yeshiva somewhere. And so rather than being something that we look down upon or that we're critical of, Rabbi Kook is saying it's because this is unique to that tribe. It's a unique part of the prophecy of what they're called to do. And so we see them as competing sometimes. Well, we often see them as competing because there's very little appreciation for the other's role. But he says, ultimately, this is a divine plan. And eventually, these two roles are going to be brought very close. Vayigash, they're going to be just literally no room between them to breathe because the two ideas are going to be so close together. So the title of the Torah portion by Vayigash is, we can see an example in Job 41:8. And in that, Job's describing the scales of Leviathan, which, remember, he's a great sea monster. And it said that Leviathan is so huge, and you know it's a mystical thing even when you're reading it in the book of Job. But they say that Leviathan is so big that his tail, as he encompasses the earth, and his tail is actually like goes past his head. His length would be longer than the circumference of the earth. I think circumference is the right word. He's that big. And of course, we know the tradition is that the righteous will feast on Leviathan in the kingdom. At any rate, Job describes the scales of Leviathan, the sea monster. It says one, referring to the scales, one is so near, and that Hebrew word there is yigshu. It's got the same root, it's got the same shoresh, Vayigash. One is so near to the other that no air can enter between them. And if you've ever tried to get a good seal on anything where you didn't want air in or out, then you understand how tight that seal has to be that Job is describing. So Rabbi Kook goes on using this reference to describe how close Joseph and Judah will one day be. He says Judah represents the first level of God's unity as acknowledged in the Shema. It's a unity manifested through the Torah and the special role of the Jewish people. Joseph, on the other hand, sought to sanctify God's name among the nations and bring knowledge of one creator to the entire world. He represents the second level, the universal unity of God. And so as long as we see those two roles as adversarial, there will always be envy, jealousy, strife, mistrust, misunderstanding, and competition. And we see that all the time. I can't tell you how many times per week I get some nudge from somebody who they brought in some crazy new thing off the internet. And when you really read down into the material, all it is just a very thinly veiled attempt to subvert Judah's role. That's it. And we need to be aware of that. I think that's why this particular Torah portion is timely, so that if you choose to go through all that garbage that's coming off the internet, that you will at least understand what to look for if you want to sift through that stuff. If it's something that's going to cast aside one of these two roles, Judah or Joseph, as Rabbi Kook is describing them, then be very, very suspicious, because it's usually unwittingly, because it's often well-intentioned, but what they don't realize is they're actually functioning in the seventh abomination of the wicked lamp, which is separating brothers. It's just new replacement theologies. So just be very cautious when you approach that sort of thing. So, and just in case you, I don't think we ever covered it in years past, but you know, when Joseph embraces his father, Jacob, it said that Jacob is silent because he's reciting the Shema, even though the Shema is not given yet. They say that this was the reason for his silence. And so this Torah portion, again, it's seen as this representation of the Shema, how there's, yes, the responsibility of the people of Israel to their own holiness, to their own purity, their own devotion to Torah obedience and Torah study, to create a lifestyle of Torah. And yet there's this offsetting tension because they do have a responsibility to be a light to the nations. And they say the Shema teaches this principle. And it said in Vayigash that it's prophesying of a future when the two missions will become so close that no air can enter between them. In fact, at that prophetic time in the future, when Judah draws near to Joseph, it is said that the righteous will feast on Leviathan. That's in Bava Batra 74b, if you'd like to look it up. It's entertaining reading. And it said, they will feast on Leviathan because they will finally understand the unity of their mission. They will achieve together the ideal balance of Torah, obedience, and edut, the testimony, the eyewitness testimony to that thing which has happened. And the question is, what happened? What is the testimony? So in Revelation, John describes these two children of Jacob. And these two children, Judah, Joseph, they represent for us the children of the Torah and the children of the testimony. Like I said, it's not a new thing in the book of Revelation. It's an old idea with a Yeshua application. In other words, the blank that needed to be filled in, the edut, the testimony. What exactly were they testifying to? Well, of course, they're going to have answers to that. But for the house of Joseph, for the one who went among the nations to be a light to the nations, the edut, the testimony, is of Yeshua. And so I've flung the question in there because I like to do that, because I want you to think through no and yes and typically come up with yes, unless we're talking about the difference between good and evil and, sinning and not sinning. Are the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God two different things? If we can look at that, then we can get an idea of where John might be going by using those two concepts repeatedly in John. So are they two different things? No, they're the same thing. If you have the testimony of Yeshua, then you should have the commandments of God, because he said he came to clarify. He came to bring to fulfillment. That was such a good find in the Beatitudes, to realize he was saying, you have heard it said, and I say unto you. It was a clarification, not a nullification of the Torah. But if you have an equivalency of expression, see, unless the expressions are identical, and they are not, commandment and testimony are not identical words. They're two different words. So they're equivalent, and therefore there must be a slight variance that's teaching us at the very same time that they're similar, that there is contrast, which I know drives the Western mindset crazy, because that's not the way we came through school. We came through school with true and false, A, B, C, D, and fill in the blank. Well, in order to wrap your mind around this, to wrap your mind around Leviathan, then you have to be able to see that the testimony and the commandments are at the same time similar and different. The two words or concepts in an equivalent expression, they're bound together. Yet the very fact that two words or concepts have to be used tells you that there is some nuance, however slight, of separation. If we put it into the context of the Haftorah, we might say there are two sticks making one whole, making one stick. And here's your famous example. The Torah is a light and the commandment is a lamp. That's considered an equivalency of expression. So the difference between the two, if the Torah is light, we know that light, it's diffuse, it's an intangible. Human beings can't control light. We don't have the ability to move clouds. We don't have the ability to make the earth turn faster or slower in order to manipulate day and night. It's an uncontrollable force of creation. It just is. The only thing you can do about light, if you don't like it, is you can hide from it. On the other hand, a lamp does give light, but it is a manipulation. It's smaller than light because lights diffuse. If the sun's up, light is everywhere. And if you were a scientist, you would know even more about light. But a lamp, having a lamp and how you use the lamp is subject to your choice. And so we have this great power of light, but if we put it into a lamp, then we can introduce it into a situation where it's useful on a personal level. If we wanted to use an analogy, we might say light and lamp, or Torah and commandment, are like saying the world versus home. The light lights the whole world. The lamp lights up the home. And you might see where we're going with this and the Joseph and Judah paradigm and their roles that should not be competing. Even though there's a contrast, nevertheless, both are needed. We need the light of the world, but we also need the lamp of the home. So let's look at Psalm 78, 5 through 10, because what we want to do is get a better handle on the testimony, the adut of Jacob and Joseph, and the Torah of Judah. So it says, for he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a Torah in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children, that they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And then in verse 9, the sons of Ephraim, which we know was a child of Joseph, the sons of Ephraim were archers equipped with bows, yet they turned back in the day of battle. All right, the concept of battle, just keep that filed away somewhere, because you already heard where Judah's hinting that Joseph might be angry and ready to do at least verbal battle. It says they did not keep the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law, his Torah. All right, now back here, he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a Torah in Israel. And it was a testimony and a Torah that should have been taught to children. Yet, somehow, they did not put their confidence in God. They did not keep his commandments. And it points out the sons of Ephraim. And it says the sons of Ephraim were warriors. They were actually equipped with bows, but in the day of battle, in the day of the heat of battle, and the reason I want you to remember battle is in the book of Revelation, the serpent is making war. There's a battle. It says they did not keep the covenant of God and refused to walk in his Torah. So the complaint here against the sons of Ephraim is that they turned loose of the Torah. They did not keep the covenant. So in a sense, they needed to be not just re-equipped, but they needed to be encouraged to return to the battle. They needed to be encouraged to return to the covenant and to walk in his Torah. This accusation could apply to Judah at different times in history, but if we look at the major portion of history, Judah may not have the same testimony at this point as Joseph among the nations, but he still walks in the Torah, at least those who have not assimilated. So here's how we define the Torah. We go to Psalm 119, and this is just sample passage. You can go through all of Psalm 119 and you'll end up with pretty much the same glossary. What we're looking for are equivalent expressions to the Torah. So we'll know how the testimony is similar to the Torah and what that slight nuance of difference might be. But remember, with Leviathan, the scales are so close that you can't get air between them. So as you're looking at these equivalent expressions of the Torah, it may be that they are so close. Once you did the study as to what each one was, you would find out that you really couldn't get air in between these words. So he says, oh, how I love your Torah. At this point, this is what we know is about to be defined by the text. What is the Torah? It is my meditation all the day. Your commandments, the mitzvot, make me wiser than my enemies. So commandments are equivalent to the Torah. They're like a subset. Like I say, you can't get air in between those. It says, for they are ever mine. I have more insight than all my teachers. For your testimonies, there's the testimonies, are my meditation. I understand more than the aged because I have observed your precepts. Precepts are part of the Torah. I have restrained my feet from every evil way that I may keep your word. Remember, Judah requested a word with Joseph. I have not turned aside from your ordinances. Ordinances are another equivalent expression to Torah. For you yourself have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste. Yes, sweeter than honey to my mouth. From your precepts, the precepts pop up again, I get understanding. Therefore, I hate every false way. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And so there we see the word is a lamp. So you can see they're interchangeable, whereas the Torah was a light and the commandment is a lamp. And this passage, the word is the lamp. So a word is equivalent to a commandment. A devar is an equivalent to a mitzvah. And so a mitzvah is an equivalent to the Torah. And you can see how that equivalency is working within this passage. But that gives you a glossary of equivalent expressions to the Torah. So is the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God, are they equivalent expressions? This passage would suggest yes, but we don't want to forget what makes them different. Even if we can't get air between them, we still want to recognize that each has a role, each has a mission. If they were identical, then you wouldn't need different words for the Torah, for subsets of the Torah or specific aspects of the Torah. So this slide is basically just showing you the list, how you would go through there. And in the passage, in fact, like I say, you could continue through Psalm 119, then you could continue this list if you wanted to. But here's another example. It says, this is in the Shema, by the way. These commandments that I command you today, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. So doorposts are equivalent, even though I've got an equal sign there, it should be an equivalency sign. Doorposts are equivalent to gates. Both words represent an opening to a dwelling, both literal and spiritual. And in fact, if we look at our paradigm of Judah and Joseph, when we look at the house specifically of Israel as a unique people with a Torah culture, a Torah identity, then you might say doorposts because it refers specifically to that house. If you say gates, the implication there is that there might be a multitude of people coming through the gates, a mixed group of people, not so homogeneous. In that case, we might look at Joseph as the one who would need to be warned to write them on the gates. He's going to have more interaction among the nations because this is his unique role. Whereas Judah is to develop the household, Joseph is to develop monotheism and ethical practices among the nations. And so Psalm 119, 105, Proverbs 6:23, it shows you this overlap among the equivalent expressions of the lamp and the light, the commandment and the Torah, and so forth. But what the commandment does is it takes that diffuse light of the Torah, which is never ending, it's just infinite. You take one mitzvah out of the Torah, you can focus that light of the Torah in a human being, and then it becomes a lamp. It becomes like a menorah. You become a people of Adonai filled with spiritual commandments that can be appreciated. You can give light to the whole house. So in Revelation 1:20 and 1:4, you can see another equivalency of expression. It says, as for the mystery of the 7 stars, which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. But in John 1:4, he said, the 7 spirits who are before the throne. So the question is, what's before the throne? Is the lampstand before the throne the 7 spirits, or is it the 7 assemblies? And the answer there is yes, absolutely. If the spirit is in the 7 assemblies, then they're equivalent expressions. If not, then Yeshua threatened to break off their lampstand because they couldn't possibly be part, or they couldn't possibly be fueled by the 7 spirits. So now let's go to the Gospels. I stuck with Matthew to make it simple so that you could see a chiasm and also an example of these 2 roles that Rabbi Kook is talking about with Judah and Joseph. In Matthew 8:4, it says, and Yeshua said to him, see that you tell no one, but go, show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. In tomorrow's class, when we do the Song of Songs, we're going to deal with this very specifically as it deals with the beloved who is described as black and lovely. And the context there is going to be in Leviticus, where you're looking for a black hair as a sign of health. And so in this passage, Yeshua says, go show yourself to the priest. this would refer very specifically to the household aspect of Israel, to a unique culture, to a unique practice, to a unique application. Definitely a more homogeneous group of like mind and like kind. And then in Matthew 10:18, we have the axis. We should get two concepts here that are going to tie these three scriptures together. So in the second time, he uses testimony. Yeshua says, "You will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles." And we know that's true. We have a testimony to the people who are close to home. We have testimonies to the Herods and the Pontius Pilates and the Agrippas and so forth. There's, the whole Greek-Roman family. But as the message began to go out, it even went to the foreign kings and to the Gentiles. You can see how it's incorporating the testimony that would have been brought before Judea first, then to Samaria, then to the uttermost parts of the earth. So you see the testimony goes to them and to the Gentiles. In the axis, you can see how it's spreading. And then in Matthew 24:14, it even takes you so far out into the nations that it takes you to the end of the age of the world. It says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." So what begins in the house, see, they had to go to the house to give testimony to the priest. The ceremony was based in the temple itself, which was called the house. And then in the end, he says, this testimony is going to go to all the nations. And so you have that contrast there between the role of Judah, who represents the testimony to the house, to the minute applications of the Torah in the house, within the culture. And then you have the contrast here with the role of Joseph, which is to take that testimony to the nations and to influence the nations. To the point that to his brothers, Joseph even looked like an Egyptian. He even looked like he was part of that world out there. And so the axis that ties the two together there in Matthew 10:18, yes, you're going to begin with this testimony here, and then you're going to progressively take it out to governors, kings, and to the Gentiles. So the question is, what exactly is the testimony of Jesus that's being referred to in the book of Revelation? If we look at Acts 4:33, I think it defines us for very exactly what the testimony of Yeshua is. Because remember, Rav Kook says the testimony, the edut, is the role of Joseph. Whereas the Torah, its minutia, its applications, its culture, that is assigned to Judah. So what's the testimony? What is this that Joseph is supposed to preach to the world? Acts 4:33 says, "And with great power, the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Yeshua, and abundant grace was upon them all." So the testimony of Yeshua was the testimony to his resurrection. And that particular generation was an eyewitness. They were eyewitnesses to his resurrection. And it wasn't just the 11 disciples. He appeared first to the women, then to the disciples, then to increasingly greater numbers before he ascended just prior to Shavuot. So this eyewitness testimony that is assigned to Joseph is given to us in Acts 4:33 as a testimony to the resurrection of Yeshua. The testimony is the resurrection from the dead, which we saw back in 2017. We could find the resurrection in every single Torah portion. And so that's Joseph's specialty, the testimony, the edut, to pass along as it has been given to us, first through words from mouth to mouth. Then it was recorded, then it was written down in the Gospels. But to pass along this testimony of the Gospels that Yeshua did resurrect from the dead, that is the power of Joseph's testimony. And so as we look back at the Torah portion, Vayigash, Judah draws near to Joseph. And remember, no air between them. That tight. Judah drew near to Joseph even before he knew that his brother was, and I put in air quotes, resurrected. They did not know that Joseph was alive. For all he knew, Joseph was dead. He didn't realize that Joseph was standing right in front of him. In fact, even as he gets so close, you can't get air between them, he still does not know that Joseph is, quote unquote, resurrected. This is just prior to Joseph's revelation of who he is. And so it shows you that if we're looking at this as prophecy, there will come a time that even before Judah completely understands the resurrection of Yeshua, he will somehow draw near to the one who has that testimony of resurrection. So here are the passages in the book of Revelation that have these equivalent expressions, whether we're using word, devar, if we trace it back from the Greek to the Hebrew, but the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God. So Revelation 1:2 is John describing himself, and he says, who testified to the word of God, to the commandments, to the Torah, and he says to the testimony of Yeshua HaMashiach, even to all that he saw. So John, who was thought to have actually been a Cohen of the priestly line, a man of the house, we might say, he's giving this testimony that's going to be passed on. This testimony of Joseph, the edut. And he even says all that he saw. That's the edut, the eyewitness testimony. In Revelation 1:9, he says, I, John, your brother and fellow partaker in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance which are in Yeshua, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Yeshua. So again, he pairs the word of God, the Torah, and the testimony, the eyewitness testimony of Yeshua's resurrection. Revelation 12:17. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war. There's our battle with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Now you can see this pattern really emerging. And knowing what you know now about the roles of Judah and Joseph, you can see who the dragon is after. This is an either or. If you keep the commandments of God, like Judah, or if you're proclaiming the testimony of Yeshua's resurrection, like Joseph, the dragon is going to be enraged with you. And he wants to battle with you. He wants to make war with you, no matter which of those roles you were in at that moment. Revelation 19:10 says, then I fell at his feet to worship him. But he said to me, don't do that. I'm a fellow servant of yours. Remember, Judah says, your servant. And your brethren. Well, the brothers were all right there. Who hold the testimony of Yeshua. Well, the brothers were about to witness to the resurrection of Joseph. Joseph is alive. So he says, worship God. For the testimony of Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy. Of course, we know prophecy is the 5 books of Moses. That's the purest form of prophecy. And then in Revelation 24, it says, then I saw thrones and they that sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Yeshua and because of the word of God. There's our pair again. And those who had not worshiped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand. And they came to life and reigned with Mashiach for 1,000 years. And so we see the point of the testimony. If Yeshua was resurrected, then the brethren, those who had the testimony of Yeshua's resurrection and the word of God, could also come to life and reign with Mashiach. And of course, we see that in the rest of Revelation, how the thrones are set up and the gates with the 12 tribes and so forth. And so just doing a little commentary on each of these individual passages. Again, John testifies to what he saw. This is edut. This is like a Joseph role. And so all that he saw, we know, would also include his firsthand eyewitness time with Yeshua, healing, teaching, as well as his eyewitness testimony to the resurrection. Healing and teaching would be identified with the Torah, the giving of the Torah, because in Jewish thought, everybody who was there at Mount Sinai was healed. They were standing, they weren't lame. They could see the sounds, they weren't blind. They said, we will do and we will hear. They could speak, they could hear. Everybody's healed, everybody's whole. He says he's a partaker in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance, which are in Yeshua, because of the word of God and the testimony of Yeshua. He's suggesting here that if you have both the testimony and the Torah, the testimony of Yeshua's resurrection and the Torah, which are the kingdom, then it's going to require perseverance and tribulation. In other words, if we have those things, then we can also expect to be partakers in the tribulation, if we want to be partakers in the kingdom. Where he says to make war with the rest of her children, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. It's lending here again an equality of the Torah and the testimony. And both of those make the adversary equally as angry, apparently. He identifies him as a fellow servant and one of the brethren who is holding the testimony of Yeshua. And that is the spirit of prophecy in the books of Moses. But it also is demonstrating the servanthood that is required by the testimony of Yeshua. Joseph was literally reduced to a slave. And then Judah also acknowledges your servant, your servant. And I think that final verse where it says, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Yeshua and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshiped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand, they came to life and reigned with Mashiach for 1,000 years. And although we've got 2 books out there that should really assure your soul that you don't have to worry about the mark of the beast, this is just another reminder that the Holy One is not playing a guess what I want you to know in the end times game. You will not receive the mark of the beast by accident. You will receive it by deciding to worship another kind and another mind. You're going to receive it when you choose to give yourself over to your self-image. And nothing's changed from the garden. The cunning serpent beast, the dragon beast from the garden, used self-image to deceive. Nebuchadnezzar, a golden image, nothing has changed. It's all about your self-image and choosing to identify with the image of a beast rather than conforming yourself as a servant to the image of Elohim. You will not accidentally get the mark of the beast. It's just not the way that's done. You have to decide to defy the word. You have to decide to give false testimony. And by the way, if you were a false witness, then you are the sixth abomination of the wicked lamp. You also are an abomination that causes desolation, because the seventh abomination is one that separates brothers. And so as we look at this pattern, and we've talked about Nebuchadnezzar's golden self-image a lot in the last few weeks because it's relevant. If we're going to understand the time that we're in, we have to understand the times past and how they just kept cycling around with Nimrod and the Assyrian and Nebuchadnezzar and so forth, down to, Hitler. It's just not new. It's surprising how often we fall for it, but it's not new. And so the Midrash tells us that it was at that moment when Nebuchadnezzar was expecting everyone to bow down to his golden self-image, that Ezekiel's dry bones resurrection experience took place at that moment. And so as the nations are bowing down to self-image, the mark of the beast, the three Hebrews alone among those nations are defying this image of the beast. They'd already received their vaccinations. They were vaccinated by the word itself. And they gave testimony to that. So this reunion of Judah and Israel that Ezekiel prophesies of, we call it the two-stick prophecy, it's a continuation of the dry bones resurrection prophecy of Ezekiel. And so just put that in the context of that occurring, the real prophecy of resurrection and a kingdom that never ends occurring simultaneously with Nebuchadnezzar's golden image, and how that would have simply destroyed any testimony he could give to his own never-ending golden kingdom. So Ezekiel 37:10 says, "So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they came to life and stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army." Okay, the battle theme keeps coming up. And so the dead became an exceedingly great army. It's demonstrating that there will be a resurrection of the dead. And Nebuchadnezzar is not going to be the one responsible for it. And we see this exceedingly great army again in the book of Revelation. It's those children of the virtuous woman. It's those sealed among the tribes. And so they are equipped because they have the testimony and the Torah, the testimony and the word. They are faithful and true witnesses like Yeshua. They are obedient to the commandments like Yeshua. And so they have been equipped to make war with the adversary. And the adversary hates their testimony of the resurrection, just like Nebuchadnezzar would have hated that, because it just destroyed his golden self-image. The fact that the three Hebrews could walk around in the furnace and not be killed gave testimony to the fact that he could not destroy them with death. Death had no power over them because of the resurrection of the fourth man that was in the furnace with them. And so the equipment of the saints is their obedience to the word and their testimony to the resurrection. And that resurrected army, it leads to this next passage where Ezekiel understands the two sticks being bound together and becoming one. And so that's why I say you don't have to worry about the mark of the beast. If you're not living a life of immediate gratification, if you are serving Adonai, obeying his word, making war with the testimony and your obedience, you're vaccinated. Your message is the one that the beast is trying to destroy. That's it. So Ezekiel 37:11 says, then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel, the whole house. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up and our hope has perished. We are completely cut off. Completely cut off. We're going to flip that. Remember, it's the leadership of Judah among the tribes that is appointed, that is prophesied to cut off the wicked one. And their leadership is relative to the feasts. And if you had any doubt before, also relative to the calendar. Now watch the progression of the good news, the gospel, relative to Judah's job. If I can advance the slide. There we go. Nahum 1:15. Behold, on the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace. That's the message of Joseph. And then it says, celebrate your feasts, O Judah, pay your vows. You see that there's two steps here. Bring the good news, bring the gospel, the testimony. That's a job of Joseph. That's his specialty, bringing the good news, announcing peace. But the specialty of Judah is celebrating the feasts and paying the vows, which were paid at the feast. If anybody knows what time it is, if anybody knows when the Sabbath is, if anybody knows when the day starts, if anybody knows when the day ends, if anybody knows how to calculate the calendar according to the times, it's Judah. And if anybody knows how to announce the gospel, it's Joseph. When these two roles are brought to peace, when you can take these two messages and make them so close, like two sticks, becoming one stick, when you can't get air in between him, then Nahum says, for never again will the wicked one pass through you. He is cut off completely. So while back here, the dry bones were saying, we are completely cut off. That is not the resurrection message of Joseph and Judah. The resurrection message of Joseph and Judah is what cuts off the wicked one. That's how we make war. We proclaim the gospel that Yeshua resurrected, and therefore we can resurrect, that the dry bones will come to life. And we also bear witness to the fact that Judah celebrates the feasts and knows how to guide Joseph home from among the nations. And all we're waiting for is peace between these two brothers. We're waiting for these two children to get so close you can't get air between them. And so here's the Haftarah. And I know we're going late, so if you need to go, I don't blame you. I'm just going to keep going because I want this to be one contained lesson instead of trying to continue it on in tomorrow's class. But here's our dry bones prophecy. It's coming from Ezekiel 37:15 through 29. It says, the word of the Lord came again to me saying, and you, son of man, take for yourself one stick and write on it for Judah and for the sons of Israel, his companions. Then take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel, his companions. Then join them for yourself, one to another, into one stick, that they may become one in your hand. When the sons of your people speak to you, saying, will you not declare to us what you mean by these? Say to them, Thus says the Lord God, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel, his companions, and I will put them with it, with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they will be one in my hand. The sticks on which you write will be in your hand before their eyes. Say to them, thus says the Lord God, behold, I will take the sons of Israel from among the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and one king will be king for all of them. And they will no longer be two nations, and no longer be divided into two kingdoms. They will no longer defile themselves with their idols or with their detestable things or with any of their transgressions. But I will deliver them from all their dwelling places in which they have sinned and will cleanse them. And they will be my people, and I will be their God. My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. And they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. Remember, we've been reading about the Joseph and the Judah roles. They will live on the land that I gave to Jacob, my servant, and which your fathers lived, and they will live on it, they and their sons and their sons' sons forever. And David, my servant, will be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will place them and multiply them and will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. My dwelling place also will be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people, and the nations will know, there's Joseph, that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. And so this two-stick Haftarah is what followed the dry bones prophecy. So the testimony of the resurrection preceded this return of these two nations, of these two houses of Israel, at a time when they will be able to walk in his ordinances and keep his statutes and observe them. And it's by this that he ultimately says, the nations will know that I am the Lord, who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. So you can see the two great plans and the beauty of those two roles no longer competing for attention and precedence, but instead becoming one. So Joseph's mission of evangelizing the nations will eventually be recognized by Judah. And then that unique leadership role of Israel among the nations is going to be recognized through Judah's Torah observance. And you don't see much of either on either side right now. You see a little bit of movement, you don't see much. That's why I say sometimes when I'm speaking in public, if I use the word rabbinic, please don't let your eyes roll back in your head and fall out of your chair. We have to start respecting both roles and accept that eventually you won't be able to get air between them. And the sooner we recognize it, the better. The sooner we can get over our suspicion of one another's roles, the better. Because we want both houses to return to the mountains of Israel with all their companions that they're bringing back from among the nations. Even Judah is bringing companions from the nations. Judah has converts. And so Judah is eventually going to draw near to his brother. His brother is going to resemble the nations. But what he's going to realize is that he hasn't lost his purity. He hasn't lost his holiness. They still communicate in the language of the Bible, if that helps. But he has not lost, Joseph has not lost the resurrection testimony of Yeshua. And we know that eventually Joseph will follow Judah to the feasts. And when these two get together, this is going to give the dragon a really good reason to make war, because the dragon knows it's coming. He knows his time is short. The more he sees the testimony of Yeshua merged with the meticulousness of Judah's Torah observance, the more angry and livid a hunter the dragon will become. And that's why we need to guard our garments. We thought it was a wonderful thing. We're in the Torah. We've got the testimony of Yeshua. Well, folks, it's going to be a battle. It is a battle. And we start small. We start with our friends and family and neighbors, right? But trust me, that battle's going to grow. He's letting you practice with the smaller battles so that you will be prepared for a day when the dragon really gets that his time is short. And you can do it. You just have to hold on to those two things. Accept that in you, even possibly, you could be an example of someone from the house of Joseph who gives that edut, that testimony of the resurrection, passing along the facts just as you learned them, restating the gospel just as you learned it. Yeshua has resurrected from the dead, and therefore we can. But you can also begin to respect the work that Judah has put into Torah study, observance, application, word studies, purity, family purity especially, retaining an identity as a people, even among other peoples, which was the main gripe of wicked Haman. You have a people out here, O king, who have their own laws and they have no regard for yours. Well, we can be that people too. We can be a people who are identified by the Torah and the testimony of Yeshua. Imagine how that would have struck fear into the heart of wicked Haman. May his name be blotted out. And so if just the Jews scare people so badly that they're willing to annihilate them, generation after generation, imagine how much more scrutiny we will be under if we have the appearance of Jews keeping the commandments of God, yet we also have a testimony of the resurrection that is not based on human doctrine, human idols, and self-image. You need to be ready. But what we saw in Acts chapter 4, those who gave the eyewitness testimony, it said, and they had the grace. As they went on their journeys, it says they had the grace of God. And so you have that. You have that with you. And take courage in that.